Hi, everybody. Talking about the Media Matrix, another documentary from James Corbett. You've probably covered more documentaries from James Corbett than anyone else on this channel. And I say that because I think that Corbett does a lot of good work. He does a lot of good work that other people are not doing. The challenge is a lot of that work, or at least a great part of it, is also compromised by his incorrect views of the world. And when I say incorrect, you have to realize that's tied to my notion of everything locking into place. There are not these segregations of, well, okay, well, that's religion and that has nothing to do with real life, and that's real life that has nothing to do with religion. It's all connected. So let me give a quick outline of the documentary. He takes us through the invention of the printing press, to the telegraph, to the radio, to television, to the internet, and then finally to the metaverse, which is probably the only dated part of the documentary. The metaverse has gone nowhere. It has gone down in a flaming pile of trash. No one thinks that the metaverse is something real, but I suppose at the time when he was making this, maybe it had enough of a media splash that he thought that people would be interested in it. But that's probably the only part of the documentary that's weak. The rest of it, in the sense of chronicling the different technologies that came about and the problems that could accrue as a result from each of these technologies. So I suppose I can stop there. I want to reference Technopoly by Neil Postman, where he Postman underscores this point that technology, whenever you adopt it, you're going to sacrifice something else. And so it's never neutral in that way. And obviously it's not morally neutral in that sense that things can be used for greater good or greater evil, depending on the context of it. It's very hard, I don't know, to use um, a sign on the side of the road that you have to hand write for evil in a way that a giant digital billboard that changes every 3 seconds. The capability for that technology's evil is much greater than the ability for you to write, on a signboard outside your house, I don't like my neighbor Bob. Okay. So I think Corbett does a good job of walking us through those technological developments. But right at the very beginning, the arguments are compromised, which then undermine the rest of his argument, which Corbett gives us the standard narrative that the church and the state were oppressing and controlling everybody in the Middle Ages. And the last thing that they needed was new ideas. And if those new ideas circulated, then, oh no, the world would crumble. So there are two problems with this construct. One is that every new idea is better than what currently exists, when that's the opposite of the case. Things that last for a very long time, they're the ones that have proven their worth. The things that come and go very quickly, those are not very valuable. And the fact that they exist does not make them good. So Corbett does nothing to stanch this idea. So he says, oh, all this was developing in America. And, once there were books and newspapers, then all these ideas could get out. So an idea is good because it exists. That's the idea behind that construct. We just need to let ideas roam freely. If you step back to examine that, if that is true, that means that you totally accept the notion of free speech, that anything can be said and there's no problems with that. So you can have child pornography, you can have devil worship, you can have the desire to, I don't know, harm your neighbors. It's all free speech, right? The problem with that notion is he then also says, well, the Reformation came about as a result, and so did the nation state, not realizing the nation state is tied to Protestantism. In Christendom, in Europe, the idea of the nation state as this entity which you would pledge your allegiance to was entirely different from the medieval notion of peoples and a land that you are part of, as opposed to, so if you think about France in the medieval time period, you love being in France, and that was a part of who you were, as opposed to the nation state coming over and making the state itself a religion, excluding God, excluding everything else out from it. So Corbett's assumptions are that the state and the church were bad, oppressive monopolies of power, and that they couldn't have ideas, and censorship is the worst thing. When, as I've said before, the last time that I talked about a Corbett book reportage, I said parents censor things from their children. There is a reason that censorship exists. Censorship is not a bad word. Censorship exists because you believe that there is right and there is wrong. That 2 plus 2 equals 4. I'm going to censor 2 plus 2 equals 5 as an idea from my children. If I had children, right? There is such a thing as math. There is such a thing as physics. There is such a thing as morality. There is such a thing as economics. These things objectively exist. They're not opinions. It's not racist to believe that 2 plus 2 equals 4, no matter what people will tell you. And so you are censoring, when you assert these truths, you're also censoring the attacks on those truths. So, for example, if you are telling your children marriage is between a man and a woman and it's forever before God, you are going to stop the production of pamphlets that say marriage is bad. Why didn't you cheat on your wife? Kids are a burden. You're going to censor those things. And in fact, I had shared this on X recently, a quote from The Framework of a Christian State. Excellent book. Finished reading it not that long ago, asking myself, where have you been my whole life? It's been on my shelf for 15 years. That's where it's been, maybe even longer than that. And I just didn't get around to it because it was 700 pages. I finally did. So the quote that I put there from the other day, which I think underlines this point that I'm talking about now, is hence the civil authorities are bound to suppress or prevent public scandals of any kind, so far as is consistent with prudence and due moderation. For cases will occur when evils and abuses have to be tolerated, lest worse evils may arise from an attempt to suppress them. Irreligious or immoral propaganda by means of lectures, writings, theatrical exhibitions, or cinemas should be prohibited. And subversive and imported publications, as well as foreign agitators and propagandists of an undesirable character, should be rigorously excluded. Public incentives to unchastity, intemperance, and gambling should not be tolerated. The sanctity of marriage should be safeguarded. Secret societies of irreligious or immoral tendencies should be suppressed. Yes, as it's being noted here in the chat, censorship is good. That is correct. It's just common sense. As I said, if I believe in math and I tell my children 2 plus 2 equals 4, I'm going to censor the opinions, pamphlets circulated in 2 plus 2 equals 5. If I believe that marriage is sacred between a man and a woman, I'm going to censor publications that attack that idea, because it's important to protect the integrity of the society. Society is built on families. Without families, we have no society. And instead, what we have post so-called enlightenment is an entirely atomistic, individualistically centered society, in which society is built on the individual. The individual gives the power to the state. God is entirely excluded. There are no rules. Who are you to tell me what to do? That's the structure we're talking about. I'll keep going with that quote. The unnecessary intermingling of men and women in industrial work, as well as the conduct of places of public amusement, such as dance halls, etc., should be carefully regulated. Facilities should be provided for the due practice of religious duties. The government should see that public officials themselves give a good example of religious and moral observance, and men of scandalous life or bad reputation should not be retained in the public service. In a word, the ruling power of a state must consider its first duty to preserve unharmed and unimpeded religion, the practice of which is the link connecting man with his God. The role of the state is to help you live life here and prepare you and allow you to interact with the church to prepare you for the afterlife. That's the job of the state, is to help you secure the good life here so that you also can pursue the afterlife with the church. So Corbett's argument, which starts with Gutenberg, attacks the authorities and says, well, the authorities are bad because they're the authorities. Why? Because Corbett's an anarchist. So he necessarily questions authority. Authority is bad because it's authority. And I said, when I reviewed his book, well, then how does he have authority over his children? I think he has 1 or 2 children. By what authority does he have authority over his children? He's just oppressing them. And one day his children will get some ideas and overthrow him out of his own household. That's the sort of argument he's making here. Now, once you've laid that groundwork, it contaminates the rest of your argument. But so let's exclude that and say Corbett doesn't make these crazy arguments that freedom of the press is good and freedom of religion is good and um, uh, freedom of speech is good. So all of the quote unquote freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. Let's remove Corbett's idea that that's good. The rest of his analysis is excellent insofar as he talks about the telegraph and how sometimes technology feels magical and strange to us, and as such, it's instinctively questioned. But that's not a good enough reason. Over time, things are going to change. I remember seeing a newspaper editorial talking about the proper clothing to wear for a telephone call. So people thought it would be scandalous for you to answer your phone in your pajamas. Now, the hilarious thing, this is before video calls, no one could see what you were wearing. But the understandable concept was that you would want to comport yourself properly to talk with someone on the phone, and you would if you were in the clothing for that situation. So by the time you're putting in your clothing for bed, you're not really in a situation to have a conversation. So the idea was correct, but as it was expressed, it was ridiculous, right? You need to be properly dressed for a phone call. Nobody can see you. So obviously, new technologies come. They come with a certain amount of suspicion, and that has to be held. I don't think there's anything to just dismiss new technology as crazy and ridiculous without just asking what Neil Postman asks in Technopoly, which is, what are the benefits that I get from this? What do I have to give up? There's always a trade-off. Technology doesn't only give and ask for nothing. It takes with one hand and it gives with the other. And you have to ask yourself, is that the technology that I want in my life? Moves on to radio and talks about the incident, the Halloween prank by H.G. Wells and the War of the Worlds. Then we go on to television and the internet, and he talks about that. And obviously, this is 2020. I think he probably had produced it before COVID, because he doesn't talk about COVID at all in that documentary series. And he had some obviously excellent takes on COVID and what was happening. But in that growth, when we talk about newspapers, sorry, that was something else that was mentioned. I didn't mention that. He talked about the ability of wealthy people to buy the newspapers and tell them what to print. And this is something that Belloc talks about in the Free Press, that most newspapers are simply beholden to their advertisers. Whatever their advertisers tell them they can print, they can print. And we saw over and over all of the news alerts in 2020 brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by Moderna, brought to you by Pfizer. Do you think that Pfizer or Moderna are going to allow you to question that their so-called vaccine is so-called safe and effective? That's never going to be permitted. Sorry, playlist, I saw your chat here. They never assess their own assumptions. People just assume something is good in an idealistic sense and refuse to adjust their view, even when they can see the uniformity of the evidence. And I wonder if we finally haven't hit a place in our society where people are willing to ask themselves that question. Is free speech really an unmitigated good? Is freedom of religion really an unmitigated good? Is freedom of the press really an unmitigated good? What is the proper role of censorship in our lives? Not just in the family, but in government. What is the relationship of God in our lives? What is the relationship of God to the government? It all has to be connected. If God is our creator, we owe everything to him. And we don't owe that individually only. We owe that as families and as societies and as nations. And so everything has to be in accord with that. So we want to create an environment in this world that is in accord with God's law. Strangely enough, when you follow God's law, everything else also goes well. You have the society that produced Christendom, that was ready. Where did all those ideas come from? They had been developing in a society that loved knowledge, that loved learning, that invented champagne, that invented all these different. Look at the cathedrals. The cathedrals were built during that time without books, without computers, without technology, without all the things we have now. We were able to build cathedrals. Where was that knowledge? So Corbett paints this idea everyone was, working in the dark somewhere with no knowledge, no literacy. It's true that the literacy rates were not there, but there's a difference between literacy and education. As the medievals were able to build the cathedrals without being able to read, we're able to read. We can't build cathedrals. All we can build are ugly buildings that are aggressively ugly. They attack us. You walk past these buildings and you feel attacked by the building because they're so ugly, they're so poorly designed. So it's not a question of being able to read. And I think that's something else too that Corbett misses. Hugo, uh, I think in Hunchback of Notre Dame, he talks about the idea of the cathedral being a repository of books, that before books, there were cathedrals, and cathedrals were this repository of knowledge. They showed you, look at what we know about architecture, look what we know about math, look at what we know about physics. That was all there in a cathedral. So Corbett mistakes the books, the technology of books for enabling something that didn't exist. There was a society that loved knowledge, that loved learning, that loved freedom, that loved sharing. And that's why you had a peaceful Christendom for centuries there. It took a while to get there. And then Luther helped destroy that with Protestantism. And with this idea that you can say whatever you want, you can do whatever you want, the church doesn't matter. In a sense, the state doesn't matter. You're your own person. So very quickly, this technology of Gutenberg, who was a Catholic, was hijacked by Protestantism, which helped to destroy the peace that the church held over Europe, and then to destroy the peace of the states in Europe at that time. So Corbett has his own agenda, unfortunately. He's not an uneducated man, but he can't divorce himself from these crazy notions he has about anarchy and authority is bad and religion is bad and everything's a construct. And I asked at the end of the review that I did for Reportage, then what's the point? If this is all just a construct and this is all an accident and we just evolved out of amoebas, then why do you care? Like he I think in the beginning of the book, he dedicates to his children, you know. So who cares? They're just constructs. They're all it doesn't matter. None of this matters. So they don't follow their conclusions. It's just sentiment in their mind. If this is really just nothing, then why do you care? Really? It's just your own sentiment at the end of the day, which is even more hilarious because they would argue, people who believe in God, that they're just scared of the afterlife, so they have to make their bet on something. But these people are not logically consistent. If there is no afterlife, then nothing matters. Then you're just doing this. You're just play acting in what is basically your own opinion about raising children and about life, and it really doesn't matter. Anyway, I don't see any other questions or comments, so I can wrap up the stream. It's still worth watching. I think, as usual with Corbett, lots of good information, but more and more his incorrect principles are more obvious to me. So I'm able to take what's good out of these documentaries. And this is really just stitched together, I think, 2 or 3 different parts of just episodes, and then he stitched it together into one. So if you just look for the Media Matrix on YouTube or Odyssey, I think you'll easily find it. And I think I put a link in the description of this live stream, so you can go check it out. I would encourage you. It's maybe like an hour total, and worth your time. And just some interesting factoids in there, particularly about the Rothschilds and the Battle of Waterloo. Worth checking out. So I will see you on the next stream. Remember to hit like, subscribe, keep the conversation going. If you weren't able to watch this live, feel free to ask questions in the comments. I'll do my best to respond to them in a timely manner. See you on the next stream.